if anybody can't make it, or if you would like to share it with a colleague or family or friend after today's session, you'll be able to do so. So today's webinar is presented by QFF and CarbonLink as part of the Farm Business Resilience Program, which is funded by the Australian Government's Future Drought Fund and the Queensland Government's Drought and Climate Adaptation Program. My name is Becca Carl, and I'm the Project Manager for the Farm Business Resilience Program at QFF. Joining me today, we have Zoe Maskell from CarbonLink. Zoe is a soil and environmental scientist working as the Manager of Project Delivery at CarbonLink, Australia's largest carbon soil project provider. She works with primary producers to identify how soil carbon projects can benefit their business and achieve long-term goals in healthy soil production and resilience, both financial and environmental. Zoe is also joined by her colleague Brenton from CarbonLink, who specialises in horticultural carbon projects and is on hand to answer any questions you might have that are specifically horticultural. On that note, we will try to answer any questions you have along the way, so please feel free to ask questions as we go. We have disabled the chat function, but please use the Q&A function to ask any questions you might have. You can upvote somebody else's question if you think it's a particularly great one. Just one other small piece of housekeeping. If you could please just keep yourself on mute unless you're clarifying a question that you've asked or in discussion with one of our speakers. It just helps limit background noise for the recording. My colleague Kerry is also joining us today to ensure we won't miss any questions you might have along the way. Now I'm going to share the slides, so I'll do that in 1 second, and then we'll pass over to Zoe to kick off. Zoe, can you just check for me you can see that?
Yeah, that looks great. Thanks, Beck. Great. All right, we'll kick off. Thanks. All right, so any of you who joined us yesterday, this is part 2 of a 2-part series. So I think that they work quite well together. Yesterday, we spoke about soil organic matter and soil carbon and how it can help improve nutrient availability, landscape health, and plant health as well. So if you haven't seen that one, definitely worth a watch. But this one is all about how to turn that carbon in your farming operation into a carbon project. Just a bit of background information on how it all works. So yeah, let's get into it. Next slide. Thanks, Beck. So just to recap from yesterday, we looked at how increasing soil carbon impacts plant health, nutrient availability, and water holding capacity, like I said before. And during this session, we're going to look into the carbon project itself as an additional source of income or a source of offsets alongside the improvements to your soil health that we learned about in part 1. Next slide, thanks. So I wanted to start off with a bit of an overview of carbon farming in Australia. Australia is actually quite famous in this space for being one of the only project-based government-regulated carbon credit systems in the world. It's called the ACCU scheme. It's a really great system in that other countries might have carbon trading markets, but a lot of them are based on trading emissions and offsets between different companies, whereas ours are based on actual sequestration projects. So they sort of have a more tangible outcome, which is really great. The concept of ACCUs, which stands for Australian Carbon Credit Units, and carbon projects was developed to address the impacts of climate change. And the way that it works is that Australia's largest emitters of carbon dioxide are required to reduce their emissions by a specific amount over time. And if they can't reduce it by that specific amount, they cover any gaps using Australian carbon credit units. They're only allowed to use Australian carbon credit units, and they're all operating under something called the safeguard mechanism, which you may have heard of. So that means that the dollars funding climate change reduction stay in Australia, and there's a consistent demand for credits over time that's driven by those safeguard mechanism facilities. Next slide, thanks. So carbon farming in Australia can be done through 2 kinds of projects. They're either an avoided emissions project or a sequestration project. Avoided emissions is where you take action to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere, whereas a sequestration project is sort of the other way around. So it's taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and storing it in the soil or in trees or, you know, in some sort of physical converted biomass. There's approved methods for achieving these, and they're made available for use by the Clean Energy Regulator. So for example, an avoided emissions project might use cool season backburning to prevent large summer bushfires. And there's a method for that called the savanna burning method, avoids more emissions going out later on. A sequestration project might be planting trees in cleared areas to build carbon in a new forest. And that method's called the environmental planting method. And the one that we work with is a sequestration project as well. And it's reducing erosion and improving ground cover allows SOC% to improve soils, and that would be the soil carbon method. So they've developed these frameworks to allow you to utilize these natural ecosystem processes. Next slide, thanks. So here's a map showing the soil carbon projects in Australia, and I'm talking about soil carbon more broadly. I touch on vegetation today as well, but the reason for that is because I work for CarbonLink, who is a soil carbon project developer and project manager. So you can see here the location of soil carbon projects across the country. The ones in blue are sort of all of the projects in the ACCU scheme, and then the ones in green are our projects. You might have noted yesterday that I said that we're one of the biggest carbon project developers in Australia. And the reason for that is because we have larger scale projects that have produced larger numbers of ACCUs when you're looking at that map. But good to see the range and spread of projects across the country. Next slide, thanks. So I wanted to go through the steps of how to generate carbon credits in agriculture today, and I've brought it down into 7 steps to generate ACCUs. The first one is you choose an approved methodology suitable to your enterprise. The second is registering your project with the Clean Energy Regulator, also called the CER. The third, you establish a baseline of your carbon stock. Then you implement eligible practice change, monitor those changes over time, and then have the project verified at the end by an accredited third party through an audit, following which you can report and apply for ACCUs with the Clean Energy Regulator. So this is a lot of what we do with our clients. It looks easy when you step it down to 7 steps, but there can be quite a bit involved depending on the complexity of the project. And so I thought I'd go through each of these one by one and just explain each of these steps so that hopefully at the end of the day, you leave having a good understanding of how it works, how you set this up, and what the actual processes are that you'll have to go through. Next slide, thanks. All right, so step 1 is choosing an approved methodology that's suitable to your enterprise. So for cropping and horticultural properties in particular, and I think there's about 14 different active methods at the moment, the 2 that would be most applicable, I think, are environmental plantings and the soil carbon method. Environmental plantings has opportunities for unused or unproductive cleared areas on a farm. They can also be used for shelter belts or riparian zones, whereas the soil carbon method has opportunities for cropping land that are designed to work in agricultural production zones. So you may look at your property and think, oh, this area could be suitable for this type of project, this area could be suitable for another. Next slide. So I thought I'd map this out a little bit. I think there's some animations on this one, Beck, if you can just click through. So you can have 2 types of projects on the same land. So here I've tried to demonstrate that with this landscape image. I think one more click should bring up some text for us, Beck. There you go. So along the riparian zone there, I've got an imaginary environmental plantings method project where you might build out the riparian area, which is a really high value ecosystem and often is selected because it has quite a risk of erosion. So it can really help with water quality and mitigating erosion. And then next to it, adjacent, you can have a soil carbon method project. So there's nothing restricting you from having 2 types of methods, maybe these 2, maybe another 2, as long as they don't overlap with each other. And there's work happening with the federal government at the moment to try and develop a method that allows the stacking of different methods on top of each other so that you might be able to one day have soil being measured on the ground and then vegetation being measured above to really capture the whole carbon pool. But at this stage, you're able to have them on the same property, just side by side. Next slide, thanks. So step number 2 is registering your project with the Clean Energy Regulator. So this has to be done so that it's formally registered. It's an approved project. You can do it yourself via the Clean Energy Regulator online, or you can work with a provider like CarbonLink to get assistance with the project design, the GIS mapping, and to be honest, the bureaucracy of just like moving through all of the application process. So working with a developer is pretty common. It helps you avoid unknown traps, make sure the project's done correctly from the start. But the Clean Energy Regulator is an open resource that anybody can access and call. So yeah, there's a couple of different ways to go about that depending on what suits you best. Next slide, thanks. So the first thing that you'll do when you're registering a project is you'll need to get your structure right. So setting up a project, you'll have to register an entity that runs the project, and they're called a proponent. They can be an individual, an organization, or a trust, and the entity is responsible for the project. They're also the body that the ACCUs get paid to into their account. Setting up an entity with the Clean Energy Regulator is kind of like setting up a new bank account. So there's things like fit and proper persons checks that you have to do, quite a bit of paperwork, so that you can have the individual organization or trust that will run the project. And then once your entity is set up, you can choose a method that is suitable to you, and you can apply for a carbon project under that method. So you have to have the two so that they can connect together. This involves project design and identifying your practice change. And just a little note at the bottom there, the account that stores ACCUs is called an annual account. It's like a bank account for ACCUs. On the right-hand side there, you can see like a couple of options. So you might register an individual, and then you might register a project under the soil organic carbon method. I think I've got an animation if you click again. Or you could register an organization under the soil organic carbon method, or maybe the Savannah Fire method as well. So you sort of have to pick one and then pick the other, and that's how you develop your entire project structure. Next slide, thanks. You'll also have to assess eligibility of the land that you're applying for. So there's rules around eligibility to make sure carbon projects are run with integrity, and that the ACCUs produced at the end of the day can be trusted to have genuinely removed carbon from the atmosphere. So for environmental plantings, projects have to be run in an area where full cam modelling exists. Full cam is the model that they use to estimate changes in biomass over time in tree projects. It has to be run in an area that's been clear of forest cover for at least 5 years. The area has to be at least 0.2 of a hectares in size, and it has to have trees established, planted as tube stock, that have the potential to attain what's known as forest status. So that's areas that are 0.2 of a hectare in size, at least 20% crown cover, and more than 2 meters tall. So that's land that's eligible for environmental plantings. For soil carbon projects, land's eligible if it's been used for pasture, cropping, or perennial horticulture. So an example they give is wineries, or it was bare fallow for the last 5 years. Soil carbon has to be able to be increased through new land management activities. You have to be able to access the area to sample the soil, so it can't be like super steep or rocky or too thick with trees that you can't get in. And there has to be at least 30 centimeters of soil present, so you can't do it in really shallow soil areas. Next slide, thanks. Step number 3 is establishing a baseline for your carbon stock. So this is the line in the sand where we're going to measure a baseline, and then over time we're going to see how much it's increased above that baseline due to a practice change. So for tree carbon projects, this is done using modelling software called FullCam, which I mentioned earlier, to confirm that no trees were present prior to planting, or to measure the change in biomass over time. And then for soil carbon projects, baseline involves taking soil samples across the project area, so actually measuring how much carbon is in the soil. We analyze them for SOC, and that sets our starting point or our baseline that we can build upon. Next slide, thanks. This is an example of a baseline round, which we also call T0, stands for time zero. You'll see throughout I've got time 0, time 1 for different measurement rounds. So you can see some sample locations across 2 different CEAs, which are carbon estimation areas for soil. So we do this. We measure the mass of the soil in total, and then we measure how much of that soil is carbon as a percentage, like your SOC percentage. And then we can work out how many tons of carbon are in that soil, and we can then work out how many tons of CO2 have been removed from the atmosphere and added to that soil over time. Next slide. Thanks, Beck. So this sort of shows, like, given that baseline round, how much carbon stock is actually present. So this looks like a topsoil. And you can see that one CEA has lower carbon stocks than the other, with the legend on the left-hand side. So this allows us to, I guess, have a starting point of, we have these 2 carbon estimation areas, they're quite different soil types, they've been well separated, and now we can introduce some practice change, and we can measure the change in SOC percentage over time. Next slide, thanks. All right, number 4 is implementing an eligible practice change. So when you engage with a carbon method, there's often an element of practice change involved, and that's true for both environmental plantings and soil carbon. Practice change means you're doing something new or different to when you started the project to demonstrate that the sequestration or avoided emissions wouldn't have happened under a business as usual scenario. So the federal government doesn't want to award carbon credits for things that would have happened anyway and then use those to offset somebody else's emissions. It needs to be something additional. Most methods outline several types of practice change you can choose from, and for soil carbon, there's 13 different types of practice change you can choose from, and there's usually something that applies to everybody that you haven't done before. So it's not usually too difficult to identify a way that you might be able to, I guess, move the needle on your carbon sequestration. Next slide. So to just touch base on something we discussed yesterday on the ways that we build soil carbon, I wanted to run over this briefly before we get into the practice change. The first thing that we do is protecting what we've already got, so protecting the loss of soil carbon by keeping soil covered throughout the year using ground cover, ideally living ground cover or mulch, and actively prevent erosion. So protect what you've got. Then we've got meet limiting factors, so that's identifying any physical barriers or nutrient imbalances or toxicities that will stop carbon sequestration occurring. And then the last one is maximizing photosynthesis, so managing plants to drive production of soil carbon and reduce the time throughout the year that photosynthesis is not occurring. And these three different ways of building soil carbon can be found throughout all of the eligible activities that are allowed under the soil carbon method. Next slide, thanks. So I think there's an animation if you just click through one. Thank you. So this is the first 8 eligible activities, and I've tried to group these into eligible activities that would suit cropping or grazing, and then I've got a couple on grazing and then a couple on landscape modification. But there's a lot of them here for a cropping system. These ones can also be used for grazing in some settings. I wanted to put these on their own slide as a reference, but I'll go through them one by one after this. So if you just jump through to the next slide, thanks, Beck. So the first option for practice change under a cropping operation is retaining the stubble after a crop is harvested. So this is one of the listed practice changes that you can use to run a carbon project if you haven't done it before. So as we learned yesterday, retaining stubble keeps biomass on the ground, and it's especially important to avoid burning, while standing stubble helps protect against wind erosion and evaporation. And this is one way of protecting what we've got, which I've got ticked at the bottom there. Next slide, thanks. The next one is converting from intensive tillage practices to reduced or no-till practices. So this is using direct drill seeding and limiting the amount of tillage, which helps reduce soil carbon exposure to oxygen. And there's an image on the right-hand side there of a direct drill seeding happening. And this is one way of protecting what you've got. So not tilling the soil reduces that exposure, and we keep what is there. Doing cover cropping on top of that would help to build the soil carbon by maximizing photosynthesis. Next slide, thanks. Which brings us to this one. So using a cover crop to promote soil vegetation cover or improve soil health is one of the most used practice changes for cropping systems. It's something that I know there's a lot of people who are already moving towards no-till or low-till systems, but cover cropping is something that isn't as widely used. So it's always, it's often a good option for practice change. Cover cropping protects the soil from erosion and exposure, and it lengthens the period over which photosynthesis occurs. So it ticks the box for protecting what you've got and also maximizing photosynthesis. That's a really great way to protect and build your soil carbon. The photo on the right-hand side there, you can see we've had some stubble and then we've had the cover crop planted underneath. All good, thanks, Beck. She's too quick. All right, so this next one is a really interesting one, undertaking new irrigation. So something that you have to look at when starting a carbon project is that there's rules around protecting carbon pools so that you aren't able to, one of the protections on that is around irrigation. When you're irrigating a carbon project CEA, you have to comply with irrigation limits that are capped to the megalitres applied during the prior 5 years plus 20%. So that's so that people don't start a carbon project and then just over irrigate their way to additional credits. And the reason it's in place is because the regulator was trying to write this legislation so that you weren't being awarded for credits here, while meanwhile the system that's losing that water is losing carbon. There's definitely ways this could be improved, but that's the intention behind it. So there's these limits. However, any water that you save through irrigation efficiency as a practice change, for example, installing new irrigation equipment, is not considered as a part of these limits. So if you were to install a bunch of new irrigation equipment that used less water and you had good records of your irrigation over the last 5 years, you have this additional buffer of irrigation that you're able to use. So this is an example of maximizing photosynthesis. And it has a lot of opportunity if the operation and the timing is right, and there's a future outlook of wanting to invest in better irrigation efficiency. All right, next slide. The next one's using legume species in a cropping or pasture system. So this would be a really good one to combine with the cover cropping. Legumes are known for their symbiotic relationship with rhizobium bacteria in root nodules, and they convert atmospheric nitrogen into plant available forms of nitrogen. So atmospheric nitrogen is very, very common. Plant available nitrogen, we know what that does for plants. Nitrogen is critically important for carbon sequestration and plant growth. So this is a great one to use for maximizing photosynthesis. Thanks, Beck. Next slide. The next one's applying nutrients in the form of a synthetic or non-synthetic fertilizer to address a material deficiency. This one is also really, really commonly used in cropping. It can include compost or manure, so non-synthetic fertilizers, or it can include standard nutrient applications, which are called synthetic fertilizers under the method. The practice change often involves soil testing to identify deficiencies and then meeting those deficiencies in your project, in your first reporting period of your project. So it's very cut and dry. It's very straightforward in terms of auditability. And if you have nutrient deficiencies there that you would like to address, it can be a really good one to use in a carbon project. This comes under the meet limiting factors bucket, but depending on what you're applying, can also absolutely help maximize photosynthesis as well. All right, next slide. This one's applying lime or other ameliorants to remediate acid soil. So you see there's a lot of different very applicable activities here that are being listed. As we learned yesterday, acidic soils can limit nutrient uptake, and we want the soil pH to be in that sort of medium range. Applying lime helps to address this by neutralizing positive ions and converting them into less acidic molecules. So it takes H plus to H2O, removing that plus on H plus and connecting it to the oxygen means that that soil is less acidic. So this can be a really great way of meeting limiting factors, because if we address this, suddenly the nutrient availability is brought back to a neutral level and plants are able to grow more effectively. Next slide. Similar one in applying gypsum to manage sodic or magnesic soils. So when clay soils contain high levels of sodium, they become dispersive. So this is because the sodium molecule, which is Na+, pushes apart negatively charged clay particles. This is really only a problem in clay soils. Whereas gypsum, which you apply to address this, Ca++, replaces the sodium and allows the particles to remain attracted to each other. And this is a way of protecting what you've got by not allowing erosion to occur and meeting limiting factors in having that sort of structure come back together. And I think I've got an animation on this one just to demonstrate it. Bring back some of my soil info from yesterday. So this is just an image of how that works. You can see nitrogen, sodium on the left-hand side. Because it's got 1+, the two of them attract to a clay particle and they actually push each other away from themselves in the middle, like with a magnet that has two positive ends. Whereas calcium has two positive charges, it has clay on either side and it's able to bring everything closer together so that that particle stays together. The other part of this is that as calcium replaces sodium, that sodium's able to leach out of the soil profile more easily and actually leave the system. And that's what we want for a long-term change in, if you're going to apply something, you want it to last for a long time. So this can be a really great way to do that. Next slide, thanks. All right, so getting into the grazing applicable practice changes now, and I know that won't be as many of the QFF members, but still good to touch on. So the three that we look at for grazing are re-establishing pasture, permanently establishing and permanently maintaining pasture where there was no pasture before, or altering the stocking rate, duration, or intensity of grazing. So I'll just go through those now. Next slide, thank you. So this first one, re-establishing or rejuvenating a pasture by seeding or pasture cropping, this adds diversity to pasture species and can be done regularly or once as an approach to building ongoing seed bank or a perennial system. So you can do this every few years, or you can try to, do it with an intent to build a long-term diversity into your pasture. The diverse species in a pasture promote diverse subsoil biology as well, and they can prolong your growth periods. You have different plants growing at different times of the year, which is a big part of maximizing photosynthesis, so big tick there. Next slide, thanks. This next one is establishing and permanently maintaining pasture where there was previously no or limited pasture, such as cropland or bare fallow. So it can be a good one if you're looking at timing or a recently purchased property where you want to move from cropland to a grazing system. This practice change is an opportunity for anyone looking to convert a relatively high disturbance area to a low disturbance pasture, supporting perennial plants and year-round ground cover. So it can be a really good one for the right operation. It's using protecting what you've got by looking after the soil resources that are there and then maximising photosynthesis by having a longer growth period. Next slide, thanks. And then this last one for grazing is probably our most commonly used one at CarbonLink. So this is altering the stocking rate, duration or intensity of grazing to promote soil vegetation cover or improve soil health. So this works by extending paddock rest and reducing the graze periods while increasing the intensity of grazing to drive animal impact. So we're having more impact for shorter periods of time and then nice long paddock rests at the end. It mimics herd behaviour in natural settings where animals will travel in dense herds and won't return to an area for hundreds of days, so that all of the gentler species of pasture that don't enjoy having that animal impact can still thrive and we can have better biodiversity. So this is a way of protecting what you've got and maximising photosynthesis. And, you know, the whole intent of this is to drive a higher level of production and biomass growth so that you can raise more cattle as well. So it's a real win-win. Next slide. All right, I think there's an animation here. These are our last two activities. So these come under the category of landscape modification. So they can apply to grazing or cropping land as well. Jump through to the next slide. Okay, so this one is modifying landscape or landform features to remediate land. And this can include things like deep ripping, controlled traffic farming, water ponding. These are sort of like the big events that you might do to change your soil structure. You might be doing it for erosion control reasons, changing your drainage. So this is like all of your swales, changing your drainage lines so that they don't cause as much erosion. It can be quite impactful. It's a way of protecting what you've got. And a lot of people look at this. The most common application is probably deep ripping, where you have damaged soils that have been impacted for a long time, maybe through multiple events of tillage. With hard pans, you can see here the example on the right hand side has that root growing through this little crack in the soil, like you would see a root growing through a crack in the rock. Like it's not going through the hard pan at all. So to allow those roots to have more room to move, breaking that up at the beginning can be a really good way to reset and have a system that's on that upward spiral. All right, next slide. This one is using mechanical means to add or redistribute soil throughout the profile. So a little bit similar to the last one, but it mostly refers to clay delving, which is where you have very sandy soils on the top and very clayey soils on the bottom. And you want to bring some of that clay up to the top soil so that it can bring all of those benefits like high cation exchange capacity, high water holding capacity up into the top soil where all of the roots are. It's pretty extreme. But can be really well used. It's more common in South Australia and Western Australia. We have even older soils than we have in Queensland, which are pretty old to be fair, but this is a photo from Western Australia where it was done. This is a way of meeting limiting factors so that you can have a more productive topsoil environment over time, but it's pretty disturbing, like high disturbance. So it has to be used in a targeted way, and you would really want to make sure that you tested your subsoils and that they weren't sodic or acidic or going to cause you any issues and brought them up to the surface. All right, next slide. So that's our 13 practice change options, grouped into ones that we can use for cropping, ones that we can use for grazing, and ones that refer to landscape modification. So there's plenty of options there to have a look at how you might apply one of these in a new way if you were interested in running the project. All right, next slide. So I wanted to show as well, this is our image from before, but that with practice change, you obviously don't have to just do one in one area, you can stack them as well. So if you click through another couple of times there, Beck, you might have this whole area as a nutrient application being applied. And then you might have an area right in the back corner there where you noticed that there was a hard pan and you wanted to do some deep ripping to alleviate that. So you can stack lots of these activities on top of each other if you're running a project, and if you're not, if you're just wanting to build soil carbon, can be a really good way to make sure you meet all three of those, protecting what you've got, identify limiting factors, and maximizing photosynthesis. All three is the best way to go. So the practice change you choose when running a carbon project has to suit your operation, and it has to suit your long-term goals as well. Next slide, thanks. The fifth one is monitoring changes over time. So we've done our baseline round, we've registered our project, we've implemented our practice change, and now we're going to go back, between 1 and 5 years later and measure the change in carbon stock. So in a tree project, that means rerunning the carbon model with some in-field monitoring requirements as well. And for a soil carbon project, we're measuring and resampling the project area. That can be directly via collecting soil samples and sending to a lab, or you can also use modeling as well, depending on your approach. Next slide. So for a soil carbon project, you baseline at T0, and then you do a subsequent round at T1, and there can be 1 to 5 years between that time. Next slide. I just wanted to run through the math of a carbon stock change estimation as well for anybody who's wondering. This slide's more of a resource, and I'll flick through it fairly quickly, but this is basically how it works. So if you had a random property that I've made up called property A, they have 10,000 tonnes of soil per hectare, and they have 1% soil organic carbon. So if we multiply our 10,000 tonnes by 1%, that gives us 100 tonnes of carbon per hectare across the property. If over 5 years they increase that 1% to 1.2, they now have 120 tonnes of carbon per hectare across their property. And if they're 600 hectares in size, that means they've gone from 60,000 tonnes to 72, and they've sequestered 12,000 tonnes of carbon in their soils across the property. However, CO2 has 2 oxygen molecules in it, and therefore it's heavier than carbon on its own. So to convert this number to CO2 equivalent, which is the units we use for ACCUs, the equivalent of a tonne of carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere, we actually have to multiply our tonnes of carbon in the soil by 3.67. So 12,000 tonnes goes up to 44,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent. Before crediting, the method subtracts some discounts for this. The discounts are confidence statistics. There's a temporary discount for the project stage. So your first issuance is reduced by 25%, and you're able to access that at T2. There's a permanence discount if you choose a 25-year permanence period, which is 0% if you choose 100 years permanence, but that's quite a commitment. And then there's a risk of reversal of 5% for all carbon projects. They also deduct any increases in emissions compared to the last 5 years. So that's for fertilizer you might have applied, tillage, livestock, all comes into account. So as a range, once all these discounts had been considered, it would be reasonable that property A under this scenario would be issued with between 20 and 25,000 credits for an increase of 0.2% in carbon. All right, next slide. So after you've done all of this work and you've remeasured your carbon and you want to make a claim for ACCUs, you have to have the project verified by an accredited third party. So that means conducting an audit. You have to comply with specific reporting requirements that are set out in the method that you choose. And this ensures that the land is eligible, your practice change has been conducted, and the stock change calculations you've done have all been done as required. You have to have all of this documentation assessed by a registered Category 2 greenhouse and energy auditor. And then the first issuance, which is always assessed, can be released. There's usually another 2 to 4 audits scheduled throughout the project life as well. So there's a few of these scattered between, but the first one is always audited. Next slide. And then the last step is reporting and applying for credits from the CER. So once you've done your audit, you submit a compliant report, all of your documentation, alongside evidence of a successful audit and your claim for ACCUs. And if all of your components are completed correctly and you have a positive change in carbon stock, then they'll issue the ACCUs into your annual account, which is really fun phone call for us to get to make. Next slide. So this is a bit of an overview of what that whole project life cycle looks like. So we've got 0 to 30 years, 25-year project, which is the crediting timeframe, which you can see at the bottom. And then the permanence timeframe starts from when your first credits are issued, and that also needs to be 25 or 100 years. So if you had a project that was issued credits every 5 years, your permanence would end at year 30. So you can see we go through, we've got the baseline sampling conducted at T0, We do another round of sampling at T1, and then we apply for ACCUs, and so on and so forth throughout the project lifecycle. Next slide. So if property A committed to that 5-year reporting period and they had a consistent sequestration every year, which never happens, sequestration is generally not consistent, but to use that example, they would see the following. So the first year they'd have 20,000 credits issued, which we saw before, and then they get an extra 25% that wasn't credited during the first reporting period if they've had that consistent sequestration rate. They get that little bump at year 10, and then after that it goes into the steady sequestration rate that they've had over time. So you get the same 33,000 ACCUs issued every 5 years. So over the life of the project, for 25 years, if everything was consistent, that would be over 160,000 credits. 1 ACCU equals 1 tonne of CO2 removed from the atmosphere. So you can use that those ACCUs for offsetting. 1 ACCU at I think yesterday's spot price is worth $36.10 AUD as well. So it's a financial product that can be used to offset, or you can sell it to someone else and they can use it to offset, and you can be paid for that. Next slide, thanks. So the question of what are ACCUs worth, I thought this would be a good one to show you guys today, and these are referenced from Core Markets and the Clean Energy Regulators Contract Register. So the core markets diagram on the top right there, you can see the ACCU price over this year, ranging from below $33 to above $38 with the y-axis there. You can see it changes over time. Yesterday it was $36.10, and those changes are generally caused by compliance for the safeguard mechanism. So you can see that price drop in April this year. That's when everyone has just submitted all of their compliance material, all of the safeguard mechanism groups, BHPs, Rio Tintos. So nobody's buying ACCUs after all of the compliance has just been submitted. We then have a bunch of reporting done to end of financial year, and then they start purchasing again up to November. And I thought it was quite interesting, but that peak before November is because everybody's being really organised before the Christmas break and trying to get their ACCUs purchased before the start of the year, which at this time of year I can definitely relate to. On the bottom there, we've got the total soil ACCUs issued to date. So this is from the Clean Energy Regulators Contract Register, which is a publicly available document. In total, there's been 382,409 credits issued. About 70% of those are from CarbonLink's projects. And at yesterday's spot price, that's worth just under 14 million Australian dollars. So just wanted to give a bit of a guide as to what's been issued and what they're worth and the market dynamics. Next slide, thanks. This is a chart from the Oricon Carbon report for November 2025. So they do most of the reporting around the safeguard mechanism. And you can see that the projected aggregate demand for safeguard credits goes up over time, particularly with a lot of commitments leading into 2030 and 2050. There's the safeguard mechanism facilities and all of those big emitters form the foundation of the demand. And then there's also a lot of government purchases as well. Next slide, thanks. So I just wanted to run through some of the companies that have made carbon reductions commitments. All of our big 3 grocery stores in Australia have. So Woolworths has made a commitment to net zero by 2050. That includes their scope 3 emissions, which accounts for 96% of their total emissions, huge number. Aldi's also got net zero by 2050. They've calculated that their scope 3 accounts for 99% of their emissions. So those 2 companies both have commitments for their scope 1 and 2 by 2030, and then they're looking at scope 3 by 2050. Coles has a net zero by 2050, but they only mentioned scope 1 and 2. They also stated that they want 75% of their suppliers by spend to have science-based targets by end of financial year 27, which is pretty soon. And then there's some big players as well, like obviously Microsoft and Amazon. Microsoft wants to be carbon negative by 2030, which is very ambitious, and Amazon wants to be net zero by 2040. So I put these up here to just indicate that the value in ACCU doesn't solely lie in sale price, but also the ability to navigate changing supply dynamics in Australia going forward. And we've always said in our company as well that ACCUs give you options. Those options will suit what works for your company, but also that you can do both. You can sell some, offset some, and at the moment, the grazing projects that we've had about 10% of the credits issued would have been able to account for their total property emissions. So there's still plenty to go around. Next slide. Of course, as well, let's not forget Australian soil carbon credits result from drawdown of carbon from the atmosphere into your soils, contributing to farm production, resilience, and ecosystem health as well. So I think the value of ACCUs, the biggest value of ACCUs is actually right there in your soil health. Next slide, thanks. I wanted to go through some of the costs of projects today as well. So obviously, carbon projects can have financial benefits, but there's also costs that arise over the life cycle of a carbon project. And they've provided these for general information purposes only and don't consider individual circumstances or outcomes, obviously. So the costs that can be involved are the cost of your chosen practice change. So depending on what practice change you want to roll out, there may be costs associated with doing so, project setup and registration, field sampling and laboratory testing, scheduled audits, and project management and reporting. So CarbonLink helps to navigate the bottom four of these, and we use third-party auditors who have their own costs involved, their own quotes that they provide. Next slide. So while there are innate project costs such as audits and activity change, service providers like CarbonLink have their own fee structures for helping design and manage carbon projects. The service offered can vary as well. So like a bank or a mechanic or any other service provider, some might offer parts of the service, some might offer others. At CarbonLink, we have a flexible model. So we have a combination of service fees and percent of ACCUs issued, which ranges between 18 and 30%. That means we have skin in the game and invest in our business's ability to get better project returns. So I think there's also developers out there that just have a fee for service. They don't have an ACCU percentage, but we do it this way so that we're invested as well. It means that an early step in CarbonLink's processes is an assessment of the overall project feasibility, which is designed to identify whether a project is suitable to progress and helps to minimise the risk of clients pursuing non-viable projects, which we don't want either. Other service providers will have different structures. Some will offer isolated components of the work, so they might offer just soil sampling, for example. Our service is based on being end-to-end, so taking care of everything from registration and sampling to ongoing project management, which is what our team does, and audit leadership and ACCU claims as well. So there's a lot of different services out there, and it's about finding what would work well for you. Next slide. Yeah, and while I'd love to provide you with more specific examples of project costs or ballpark figures, ACCUs are listed as a financial product, which means I'm not able to discuss generalizations like that under our AFSL, our Australian Financial Services License. However, if you would like to know more specific information about your property, please send me an email after confirming the items we need to for our license. I'm more than happy to provide you with specific details about your property and any potential project. Next slide. So I wanted to end talking about commitments as well. Committing to a carbon project is really important to understand. It means you're committing to the permanence period, which is usually 25 years, and the practice change that you've selected across that permanence period. There's also rules around managing carbon pools within CEAs. For example, changes in the way you can manage trees where carbon is being estimated, or how much water can be applied through irrigation. And it's important to understand which of these rules apply to you before committing to a carbon project or a carbon method to make sure you're able to work within the rules and that the project is designed in a way that will work with your operations, because you can mitigate some of these challenges by project design. When deciding to take on a carbon project, it's critical that it aligns with your forecast for the farm's operations and sustainability. But for a lot of people, a carbon project becomes a natural fit for their long-term plan for soil health, financial diversification, and market access, which is what resilience and sustainability is all about as well. Next slide. Thanks, Beck. And finally, I just wanted to finish saying that carbon projects will reward practices that build soil health, improve water efficiency, and enhance resilience to climate variability. By integrating carbon-friendly practices into operations, farmers can boost productivity, reduce input reliance, and if suitable, create an additional income stream, supporting long-term farm viability and intergenerational resilience. But if you're interested in all of the non-financial benefits and soil health, I would definitely recommend you go and have a look at part 1 from yesterday, which really dives into why we care about adding carbon to the soil in the first place. I think that's my last slide. Thanks, Beck.
Amazing. Thanks, Zoe. So I did have a couple of questions. First one is, you kind of touched on it when you were talking about the ways that a business could potentially use ACCUs, but some of the language that gets talked about in farming is insetting versus offsetting. And I know you talked about it in the context of offsetting, and I think you were talking about it for your own business. But would you be able to just elaborate on that a bit, and why a business might decide to do one or the other, or how that kind of works?
Yeah, for sure. So, carbon offsetting is using carbon credits that are sourced from somewhere else to offset emissions in your business. So that would be something like BHP purchasing credits from a Australian soil farmer, soil carbon farmer who is selling them to them. So the businesses are not linked. Insetting is where a business would produce its own carbon credits and use them to offset other emissions in that same business. It often actually works through, say, a company like Coles would maybe fund a carbon project on a beef property, and in that business would then generate their own carbon credits that they could use to offset their other emission scopes. But it can also be used by an individual farm to offset their own emissions and sell a carbon neutral product. So a cotton farmer could produce carbon credits on their farm, and then they might use their carbon that they've sequestered to offset the emissions caused by their machinery, by the fuel used on farm. They could even look at offsetting some of their other scopes of emissions with transport, airline, freight, that sort of thing, so that it's all in the same business. So I guess the broad difference is whether or not you're sourcing those credits internally, or you're purchasing them from someone else who has done that sequestration.
And where a business is part of a global supply chain like Coles and Woolworths that you had on the slide there, talking about, what they are looking for in their targets and their supply chain, is that sometimes where you see businesses consider insetting, where they might need to service a market and they may need to be carbon neutral themselves?
Yeah, I think it's becoming more and more talked about over time, obviously, as we approach some of those 2030 and 2050 timelines. But initially, when running carbon projects, it was mostly about selling those credits so that somebody else could use them as an offset. It's becoming more and more interesting to landholders to generate their own credits so that they have the capacity to use those ACCUs to offset their own product so that they can sell to a business who's trying to reduce their scope 3, or so that they can have market access in different ways, or demonstrate, through a really watertight avenue that what they're producing is carbon neutral or is sequestering carbon. So it's something that's starting to be talked about more and more, but that I think as we get closer to some of those timelines is going to need to be demonstrated. A lot of people are being contacted by the people that they supply to now, asking for assessments of emissions, like what are your numbers? This is the next step of, here's my numbers and here's the credits I've produced, and so my number is actually carbon negative, and this product has been verified as being carbon neutral.
Awesome. Thanks for clarifying that. And then, so with that in mind, then, if a business is thinking about undertaking a carbon project, and they do a baseline, and they're thinking that, as we talked about yesterday, a lot of the potential practice changes that could be included under a method are good for their business anyway. And they go through a feasibility process with you, and they realize that actually the costs associated with the project at this stage just don't stack up. The spot price isn't high enough, the audit fees are too high. If they have done a baseline, can they retrospectively go back and then measure that carbon afterwards if they have a robust baseline?
You can't do that at the moment, no, not with the ACCU scheme. It has to be, you can only baseline your property after you've registered your project.
Okay.
Or at least submitted the paperwork to register your project. So we've had people before that have done baselines outside of the ACCU scheme and they haven't submitted all the paperwork for a project, and even if that round was done in compliance, it needs to be associated with that application. There's other groups out there that aren't related to the carbon market as such, but Accounting for Nature is one that that just looks at ecosystem health, and you can retrospectively use data in their framework. And I think that's because there's no financial product involved, right? So it's not as stringent, but that's a way that you're able to show environmental condition change over time and demonstrate that to somebody, if that was something you wanted to do.
Yeah, great. But I think it's important, isn't it, to recognise from a producer perspective that a lot of these practice changes are really beneficial for people's businesses anyway. But if you're doing them and then you're thinking maybe down the track you might want to undertake a registered carbon project and to register it for the purpose of getting ACCUs, that you're potentially eating into your capacity to get ACCUs for your business.
Yeah, potentially. And we have got a lot of clients who obviously like the early adopters who are really confident with their ability to sequester carbon. They've been doing it for a long time. They've been wanting something like this to, to get that additional income stream. And they did a lot of great work with that land for sometimes over 10 years, getting it up to a really healthy state that they aren't able to be repaid for. They're repaid for it in the health of their farm, but yeah, it's a real shame, but it's just how it's designed at the moment.
Oh, great to know. Thanks for clarifying.
That's
Right,
okay.
well, unless anybody else has any other questions, I'll just do a very quick check of the Q&A. No, I think we're all good. So thank you again, Zoe and Brenton, for your time. Like we mentioned earlier, everybody, if you didn't get a chance to see the first part of the webinar, they'll both be available on QFF's YouTube channel in the coming days. And yeah, that one was focused more on the benefits of soil health as opposed to the financial benefits that a carbon project can provide to your business. I'll just go to the next slide to share, because there is Zoe's details. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to her directly.
Absolutely. Great.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Cool.